John Hanlon, who is here tonight. I want to welcome him. John does wear a number of hats, and the one he's here to talk to us about tonight is he's a driver for the Mayflower Trolley in Provincetown, and he's done that for 10 years. So without any further ado, thank you, John, for being here.
I'm used to wearing this while I drive a trolley and do this tour. Is this close enough? Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. So I've never done this like in a PowerPoint. So I do have some notes here, just because I can maybe give you a little more details of some of the things received than I have time to when I'm driving down Commercial Street and bikes are cutting in front of me and people are trying to pass, and I have to kind of keep moving. But I'll try to keep it, short enough that you don't get too bored either. So like Julie mentioned, I was a teacher in Provincetown, a biology teacher for 20 years, and some of you probably know that that school closed in 2013, just due to lack of enrollment. And one day, in the winter, I was just walking down Commercial Street, and a former student of mine, a really smart guy, you've probably seen his name in the newspaper these days, Raphael Richter. He owns several companies now, but I couldn't convince him to go to college. He said, I don't need college. And he didn't. He's an entrepreneur, and he started this business because Yvonne D'Souza, who used to do the trolley tour in Provincetown for many years, probably 20 years before that, she started to develop Alzheimer's, and so Raphael came in and started this new company. And he said, do you want to drive the trolley? And I said, why would you want me to drive the trolley? He said, well, because you were the bus driver, you know how to drive it. And I said, okay, do you have a script? Or, and he said, well, you can write that. And so Provincetown's a really interesting place. I learned a lot in writing that and in doing this tour. I've learned a lot more, much more than I ever knew just teaching there. Because teaching in Provincetown, the high school was very much its own little community, and our life was the sports and the dances and those kind of things. And then you really weren't connected to the wider Provincetown community. There's such a great history there, and such a wonderful, accepting community. And don't get me wrong, it's a small town. Everybody knows your business, and they gossip about you. Especially in the winter when they just make things up because there's nothing else to talk about. But it's a really special place, and doing this, I learned that. So I wrote the script, and it's changed over the years, and I still do it part-time. I have other jobs, as Julie mentioned, so I still drive every Friday. So what we're going to do is, this is the actual trolley. Some of you may have seen it before. Has anyone done the tour before? Great. Okay. So, and every driver you get to has a little different story. We don't memorize the script. It's just like an outline, and you talk more about things that you're interested in, or some parts of it you have more time to talk because of the whole traffic situation. So we're going to start out at the pier as if you're coming in on a cruise ship. A lot of our tours start. We pick up folks coming in on a cruise ship. Usually they're on their way between Martha's Vineyard and Newport or something, and they're only here for maybe a half a day, so they don't get to see as much. So they get on the trolley out on the pier, and then we come down Ryder Street and we take a left by Town Hall, and we go all the way to the West End, and then up through the dunes, the National Seashore, and come back through the East End along Commercial Street. So that's the route we'll take tonight. Please interrupt with questions if you have them. I'd much rather do that, so I tell people on the trolley too, is ask questions as they come up. It's not a formal presentation that you can't interrupt. Okay. All right. So just a little bit of Provincetown history. You all know about how Cape Cod was all made by the glaciers and all. Provincetown, as some of you probably know, wasn't made by the glaciers. When the glaciers made Cape Cod, it ended right there at High Head. High Head is that point in Route 6 where you crest over the hill and you can see all Provincetown in front of you. That was the end of glacial Cape Cod. So thousands and thousands of years of erosion From North Eastham north, that's sand built Provincetown. From North Eastham south, that's sand built Monument Island. And that continues today. Those places are still growing. So Provincetown is actually growing. Even though with rising sea levels and all, some places are eroding, like the Herring Cove Beach parking lot, but there's a net gain of sand there. From 10,000 years to the present, there has been a human presence there. The Wampanoag people lived there. It was known as Mashpee. About 1,000 years ago, the Vikings, there's evidence that the Vikings stopped there. And then, of course, 1600s, everyone knows, not everyone knows, most people think they landed in Plymouth first, but the Pilgrims landed in Provincetown Harbor for about 6 weeks before going on to Plymouth. Through the 1800s, it was mostly English and Irish living in the town. The town wasn't established until 100 years later, 1727, after the Pilgrims. But there was still a presence there, as we'll talk about later, more out in the dune area. And then the Irish came. The whaling industry was very big. At one time, Provincetown was the third wealthiest community in Massachusetts after Nantucket and New Bedford because of the whaling industry. Until that ended very abruptly and oil was discovered. And that's when the Portuguese started to settle there. Much of the crew, those whaling ships, the Provincetown whaling fleets wouldn't go around the world like the ones in Nantucket. They would just go across the Atlantic and back. So they would go across the Atlantic with not a full crew, and they would pick up crew in the Azores Islands off Portugal. And many of those crew people, when whaling ended, they stayed in town. And they really built the west end of town. So they call that, that was always the traditional Portuguese part of town. The east end, as you'll see, was always more of an artistic summer community. Of course, the Portuguese were fishermen, so they really built the fishing industry there. 1916 is when the arts community really got started. There was a bad storm in 1898, the Portland Gale, that wiped out the whole fishing fleet of Provincetown, and many of the men had to leave town. So the women who were left behind, they rented out rooms to visitors, because 1916, World War I had started. Lots of artists that used to go to Europe couldn't, and they said, let's get on this train in New York City or Boston and see where it goes. And it went to Provincetown in those days, and they found the beautiful landscape, and so artists kept coming. Many of them were folks from the LGBT community, which in those days maybe wasn't as out there, and so they found a safe place that they could stay. These Portuguese fishermen's wives would rent out rooms to them and not be judgmental, and it was safe. So that's kind of how that evolved, and of course then tourism took off, when the highway was built and all. All right, so starting in Provincetown Harbor, it's the second deepest natural harbor in the world, which seems strange when I looked that up, but I double checked it. It's true. There's one in France that's deeper, and the whale watching industry started on the East Coast in Provincetown in 1975. So went from whaling to whale watching. Of course, the Dolphin Fleet is one boat that's left. It used to be the Portuguese Princess. And, the fishing fleet in Provincetown has changed quite a bit. There's probably about 15 to 20 boats left, most of them lobster boats. In the winter, a lot of them are scallop draggers, sea scallops. Day boats, there isn't a lot of big fishing happening there anymore. If you're out on the pier, if you ever look, so McMillan Pier is the public pier, and if you look to your right, that's a private pier. The Cabral family owned it for years, and it was just sold a few years ago. There's some paintings of some women up there. That's called They Face the Sea. That's the Portuguese women, their husbands were fishermen, and they would watch, down on the dock watching for the boats to come back. So that's a tribute to them. It was done one year for the Portuguese Festival, which happens every year at the last weekend in June. And the pier itself is named for Donald McMillan. Does anyone know who Donald McMillan was?
He was an Arctic explorer.
Yeah, an Arctic explorer. So sometimes if you go to the museum at the Provincetown, or the Pilgrim Monument, there's polar bears and penguins and things like that, and it doesn't seem to fit. So he was a hometown kid who went on Admiral Peary's crew to explore the Arctic, and the pier was named after him. So as you work your way down off the pier into the square, there's Loeb Square and there's Portuguese Square. So Loeb Square is the one at the foot of the pier. Portuguese Square is the one by Town Hall. If you ever noticed this giant anchor there, that was brought up in the fishing nets of the Captain Bill. The Captain Bill was a fishing boat owned by local Provincetown fishermen in 1957. And they donated it to the town. It was the anchor from a 1800 schooner ship, and came up in their net. And 20 years later, that same crew and that same boat all drowned. During the storm, the ship went down. So that's kind of a memorial to them now, the Captain Bill. All right, so then we're going to take a left, not going to stop for ice cream at the New York store, and we're going to stop in front of Town Hall. So Provincetown Town Hall is a really interesting building. About 20 years ago almost now, it was renovated, but it's an old Victorian. The original Town Hall was actually up on the hill, up where the monument is now. But it's an 1836 Victorian era. 2010 was the renovation. Joan Rivers did her last show there in 2014. She died about a week later. And that's where the first same-sex weddings were held in 2005. We used to have our prom there at the town hall. The high school would have its prom. They would roll out a red carpet, and the whole town, well, whoever was around in May, would come and watch the kids as they walked up the red carpet. And we had classes of 20, 30 kids. It wasn't a big class, and that was like a big deal. Having prom at town hall, you spent the whole week before decorating it. I know it sounds like something from like small town in the Midwest or something from the 1950s, but this was right up until 2013. While it was under construction, we had it, for 2 years we had it at the Crown and Anchor at one of their disco bars. That was interesting. Even at Town Hall though, drag queens would come and dance, and everybody would dance, the whole community would be dancing. It wasn't like now, a lot of towns you see now where kids get limos and they go to a hotel and they go to a party, and like this was like a community event. It was really cool. Which is why I just love teaching. So if you're at Town Hall, there's a couple things that you might not notice that are on the grounds around Town Hall. One is the AIDS Memorial. So there's a granite stone with waves on it, and there's an inscription on it. And during the AIDS crisis in the 80s and early 90s, Provincetown was really a refuge for many people that were cast away from their families and from their homes. They came to Provincetown to die. And a lot of people stepped up and took care of them. People that were nurses and doctors and just volunteers. And the kids, there used to be an AIDS support group in town, and the kids would make dinner once a week and would bring it down and eat with the people. It wasn't just bringing it and leaving. We would eat dinner with the people that would come to the AIDS support group. And that is really a testament to the kind of place Provincetown is. And then in front of that, there's the Doughboy Veterans Memorial. So all of the veterans from Provincetown that have died in foreign wars, that's in the front, right up along Commercial Street. And Provincetown, it's been knocked down since the VFW. That's where everybody would have their graduation parties at the VFW. It had a really strong presence in Provincetown, veterans and that heritage. There used to be a guy who was one of those statues that he would dress up as an army guy right in front of that, and then when he went by, he would try to scare you. I haven't seen him in a few years. And then the other side of the lawn at Town Hall, there's this monument here, the Rose Dorothea. So we'll talk a little bit more about the Rose Dorothea towards the end. But the Rose Dorothea was a racing ship. So there was the one and only Lipton Cup yacht race before the America's Cup. It was 1907. And some fishermen from Provincetown built a boat, and they got it in the race, and it won the race, even though it broke a mast during the race for its birthday year. And that, like I said, they'll come up later in another spot along the tour. So next time you're at Town Hall, notice those few things. Okay, so we're going to start working our way down Commercial Street. So Commercial Street was built in 1835. It's supposedly one way, but it's really only one way for vehicles. Everyone else goes every way possible they can. It's only 22 feet wide, so it's really narrow. And I'm driving a trolley that's about like 15 feet wide. And there's UPS trucks parked, and there's people left their bikes out, and we have like just inches of clearance on both sides. I'm constantly pulling my mirrors in and out. But it was originally built as a dirt carriage path, so that was the width for two carriages to be able to pass each other in 1727. And I don't remember this, but I've been told this, I don't know if some of you may remember, until the 1950s it was two-way with parking.
For bicycles.
Yeah. Okay. So just beyond Town Hall, there's a nightclub there, but that was the original church in town. That was the Church of the Pilgrims. That was the Congregational Church. So the first church in Provincetown is now a nightclub. So I can't imagine how that would have gone over 400 years ago. Then Adams Pharmacy there, it's no longer Adams Pharmacy. Stop and Shop came in and CVS came in and they kind of went out of business, but it still has the name Adams. It's a convenience store now. Up until 2024, that was the oldest continuing operating business. It goes back to 1875. They had an old-fashioned soda fountain there and all that. And Crown and Anchor. I'm not using my notes, but I'm going to get too confused if I start going to that. So I'm just going with what I do for the tour. Crown and Anchor on your left, so that's the big complex. That's where we had our prom for a couple of years. That burned down in 1998. Some of you may remember that. Next to it, there was the Whalers Wharf where the cinema is and the shops. That all burned down, and the Crown and Anchor's next to it. Provincetown is all wood, really. The town is really built from the wood that was out in the West End, what's now the West End Marsh. And it's very close in proximity. So, we were lucky the whole town didn't burn that, but I remember when that happened. But this, anyway, is the oldest hotel in town. So there's a hotel there, there's several nightclubs, there's an outer bar. Now the Provincetown Brewing Company is there. That's the restaurant that's there. Okay. And then the oldest continuous church now is the Unitarian Universalist Meeting House Church. That was built in 1847, so that's on your right now. And there's always some kind of activity going on in the yard there. They do drag bingo as a fundraiser. They do all kinds of speakers and shows. 1918, that was an infirmary for the flu epidemic. 1995, that was the center of the AIDS ministry that was done in town, kind of a place where everybody could get support. The steeple is not straight. That's what everyone in Provincetown says. Like everything else, it's not straight. That happened during that storm that I told you about, the gale of 1898, when all the fishing fleet was lost. It bent the steeple, and it's still bent. So when you walk by, you notice that. Yeah.
Does it function today as a church?
Oh yeah, very much so. It's very active.
And what are those buildings on the right? Are those residential?
I'm trying to picture them. They're stores. At least the front
Those
part.
are stores?
Yeah, at least the front part is a store. But maybe there's residences in the back. Yeah. So then going a little beyond that, there's the Benjamin Lancey House. I don't know if you ever noticed that. It kind of looks like the Psycho Bates Motel house. It's a similar story. Benjamin Lancey, who owned that, his mother passed away during the winter, and they couldn't, the ground was frozen, they couldn't bury her for 3 months, so he propped her up in the window.
Give her a pipe to smoke.
That was, I can get you a date on that. I can get into my notes here.
Is she still there?
No. 1950. So if we were on the street, if you know the street well, directly across from this is like the marine specialty store, right? And back behind that, there's an old alley. There's a lot of alleys in Provincetown. Those were all wharfs originally. There were 69 wharfs in town. And all but one was wiped out during that storm. The one that remained was the one that was built it was just built a year earlier, so it was probably a little stronger. Captain Jack's Wharf down in the West End, which we'll get to. But the wharf right across from the Benjamin Lancey House was Lancey's Wharf, and there is an interesting piece about that. In 1947, Henry Fonda and Joan Crawford filmed a movie there. Don't know what it's called.
What's the house used for now?
It's a store down below, and I'm not sure, maybe the people live upstairs. Yeah. Pretty much every house on Commercial Street is commercial, at least at the ground floor, because it's just a lot of people can sell things, you know. Okay, so then we're moving down, and you may have noticed there's a little alley that's kind of a shortcut up to Bradford Street. If you parked up at the old high school, so that alley goes by the Atlantic House. So the Atlantic House was the first gay bar in the United States. But before that, it was pretty famous for a lot of entertainers. Back in the 50s, Billie Holiday played there, Eartha Kitt, Barbra Streisand used to bus tables there, and then if it was a slow night, they'd let her sing. Several people played there. Liberace played the piano there. And then just next to that is this K-Tip Sportswear. But if you ever look to the top floor, there's a little Masonic symbol up there. That's a Masonic lodge up there. And that's the oldest Masonic lodge in Massachusetts. It was chartered by Paul Revere in 1795.
Wow.
And the trowel that President Teddy Roosevelt used to lay the cornerstone for the monument is up there. Then we have Siemens Bank. So Siemens Bank is a great, to go in, just look at the artwork there. There's a lot of watercolors and different artwork from local artists. And then the post office there. The post office, there was a funny story. Yeah, there's a dent in the wall from 1949. There was a shooting by the postmaster. Pitted citizen versus citizen. So there was some kind of argument there, and there was a shooting, and the dent is still in the wall there. It was built in 1932 during the Hoover Public Works program. That's why it's such a big building for a town of 3,000 people. It does go up to 100,000 people, like next week when the carnival's on, it'll be up to that. But normally it's 3,000 year-round people. And that number hasn't really fluctuated much. Even when we had school going and more families, it's always stayed right around that. Okay, then we continue and we find the Aquarium Mall. So if you ever wondered why they call that the Aquarium Mall, but it was an aquarium. In the late 60s, early 70s, the biology teachers, my precedent by a few people, he had an aquarium that he ran there, and he had dolphins. Now it's a kind of a food court, an outdoor food court, and there's a bar at the end that the public can sit at. The Gifford House is not on Commercial Street, but if you're going, it's up Carver Street, so it's at the very top of Carver Street, the corner of Carver and Bradford. Gifford House is a really old hotel. Al Pacino, 27 years old, he was in a play there, 1967. So Spear's Pizza, of course, most people probably are familiar with. All the bars close at 1, but they stay open till 2, so a lot of people hang out there and get pizza. You may have seen, they just filmed a movie this spring about Anthony Bourdain, of his time in Provincetown. His apartment that he stayed in was behind Spear's Pizza. So he's good friends with John Yingling, the owner of Spear's Pizza. 193, so this kind of down the alley behind that building, that was a place, it was the oldest lesbian bar in the United States. It was the Ace of Spades. Originally there was the Pied, and then Leah Delaria bought it a few years ago. She turned it into a jazz club, and now it's just a restaurant. But there's a funny story that goes along with that. Jackie Kennedy, when she was First Lady, she came to Provincetown with Gore Vidal. They had some connection. What was it? They shared a stepfather. Yeah, with whom she shared a stepfather, Hugh Auchincloss.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, before my time. So it was the two of them plus a Secret Service agent. And they were refused admission because the doorman failed to recognize Mrs. Kennedy and she was traveling without her ID card. And the Ace of Spades had a club license. The club was legally bound to limit admission to 2 members. And anti-gay selectmen were targeting it for not enforcing its membership rules. So it was, even though despite who she was, they couldn't break that rule in that area. Okay, so the firehouses in Provincetown, I don't know if you've ever noticed them. We have all these little firehouses through town. Up until 2 years ago, it was still an all-volunteer fire department. And that was one of the things, like when you're a kid growing up in Provincetown, that was something you really aspired to, is to get on the fire department. Your father, your grandfather were on the fire department. So just a few years ago, it was very contentious, but they decided they needed to more modernize the force because of, you know, such a tinderbox there. So this is firehouse number 2. So they turned this into a bathroom. So you can go number 2 in firehouse number 2. It's a public restroom. And then as you get a little bit past Bugala's and up the hill a little bit, you start to see all the captain's homes. So from that whaling era, most of those homes, like some of them are inns now, those were all belong to the whaling captains. Lorenzo Dow, who introduced bananas to Boston in 1871, and he had a house out on Boundbrook Island. He had one of those inns. You notice some of them have stone walls around them. Those are all perfectly rounded stones that were brought over here in the ballast of ships. And then when they got here, they used them to build those walls. Because Provincetown, like I said at the beginning, it's all sand, right? It's just all sand being pushed up here. So there's no rock here naturally. All right, then the boat slip. So the boat slip was started. This was just a public park at one time. Reggie Cabral, who owns the Atlantic House, he owned one of the guest houses across the way, one of the captain's houses. He wanted to put a public park there. But there was a divorce settlement, and his wife got the house or something, so he decided to build a big structure there to block her view of the harbor. Provincetown's full of these like little stories and gossipy inside backstabbing stories. If you ever really want to learn a lot about Provincetown, read the book P-Town. It was written by Peter Manso, about 20 years old. It's really funny. So he built this club there, and it's a place where they have something called tea dance. So if you want to go out dancing but you don't want to be out late, it's from 4 to 7. They have a big open deck. It's a mixed crowd and DJing right over the beach. It's very popular. Roy Cohn, remember Roy Cohn, who was McCarthy's buddy. He used to secretly come to Provincetown and stay with Norman Mailer, and he would always be seen at the boat slip. That's where he liked to party, and the Atlantic House. Just beyond that is the Martin House. So the Martin House was built in 1750, so this is a good example of, that house has no front door, right? The houses that were built when it was still a dirt path, they don't have front doors on them because you entered the house from the beach. You had a wharf behind your house and you came in that way, not from the street. So Martin House has an interesting history. Some people say it's haunted, some people say it was used in the Underground Railroad, but I've heard conflicting reports on the railroad part, the haunted part, who knows. And so as I mentioned before, if you go down Commercial Street in the West End, you kind of look up all those side streets between Commercial and Bradford. It's all these really dense, small homes that were built by the Portuguese fishermen. And there was actually a school down there. It's now the Commons, but it was the West End School, and they had their own school. And they were rivals to the East End School, which we'll see when we get in the East End. And it was just huge, young communities of fishing families. The whole town is really just, 80% of the homes now are second homes. And the average price of a house in Provincetown is $1.8 million. The average annual income of a resident is $50,000. So it's really, it doesn't have any, the West End has the best gardens now, but I wouldn't say it's really Portuguese anymore, you know? But even the kids I had in school, some of their parents are still there, or their grandparents, and they are still in the West End mostly, yeah. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily, could call it Portuguese anymore. So, Francisco Gaspa House, I don't know if you've ever noticed this one. It's on your right, as you're working your way right before the Coast Guard station. So, in those days, someone that wanted to impress people, they would build their house out of brick. And the only fully brick house in town is Norman Mailer's house in the East End. But Francisco Gaspa, he got about halfway done. The first level is all brick, the second is wood. And he has his name engraved in it. So that was another status symbol for him. He was a fisherman that made it big as a captain, so he made some money. His son wrote a book called Leaving Pico. It's a pretty contemporary book, but it was about him growing up in the 1950s in the West End of Provincetown. It's fiction, but it's based on his experience growing up there. And then the Coast Guard station on your left. So this is we call the new Coast Guard station. It was built in 1979. It was the first federal building to use solar energy. And that's kind of behind the gate there. I always wonder, when you get these 18-year-old kids from the Midwest or wherever, and they get plopped down in Provincetown, what they're experiencing. But it's really kind of a compound almost, unless you don't have to go into town at all. You just drive in there and you protect, the gate protects their property. So the road right after the Coast Guard station, the road takes a sharp left. And instead of going straight, remember the guy, Benjamin Lancey, who had his mom in the window? His father owned that property. He had a salt mill there, and he wouldn't let the town, he wouldn't sell to the town to let the road keep going straight. So it curves left really sharp. And that's engine house number 1, so it's another firehouse down there. That one's been turned into a private home. And being a firehouse, it has 3 bathrooms, but only 1 bedroom. And that, up until a few years ago, that was owned by Brian Raffinelli. He was an event planner. He did Obama and the Clinton inauguration parties and all. But I heard he sold it since then. Okay, so then we've turned left, now we're kind of going back again along the harbor, and these are 2 prominent houses there. Does anyone here watch American Horror Story? I don't either, but you do. So Ryan Murphy is the creator of Glee and American Horror Story. He has a summer home in Provincetown. He has several, actually. He filmed that, season 10, he filmed in that house at 103 Commercial Street. That was about 3 or 4 years ago. And then the other house, right next to it, number 91, that was the home of Gary Studs. Gary Studs was our congressman from the Cape for many years, from the mid-70s to the mid-90s. And he was a big advocate for the fishing community. He was the first openly gay congressman. He got the 200-mile limit passed. So in the 70s, these small boats in Provincetown and all over the Cape, they couldn't compete because these Soviet trawlers were coming in really close to the shore and taking all the fish. So he got a 200-mile boundary that they couldn't come in, and he really saved the fishing fleet. And his district went from New Bedford all the way out to Provincetown, so it was really a fishing district. The West End Racing Club on the left, just beyond there, is a really great organization. If you're a kid growing up in Provincetown, this is still true today, you can go and spend every day learning how to sail and swim down there. And teachers from the school, that would be their summer job, they would run the West End Racing Club. And I don't think it's much more today, but last time I checked, it was like $50 for the summer, to get that kind of care and learning how to swim and sail. It's all funded through a fund that the fishermen established, and they do fundraisers and contribute to because so many fishermen didn't know how to swim and they would die when the boats would go down. So they want to make sure every kid who grows up in Provincetown knows how to swim. So if you're in Provincetown in the next couple of weeks, they're doing their end of summer raffle, and they'll be selling tickets, at the old firehouses or at different places in town, and it's a really good cause. 7476 Commercial Street. So 74 was the Soper house. Edward Soper, he was the president of the bank, and he built his house with 8 sides. He wanted to make sure that it deflected the wind from all sides. And so now one side got all the brunt of it. And then to the right was Hans Hofmann's studio. So Hans Hofmann was a German artist that came over here to study at the Cape Cod School of Art, which was in the early 1900s. Charles Hawthorne started that in 1899. And so that's got a green door. You can't really tell from that picture, but if you're driving down the street, it's the only house with a green door. And the studio is in the back. That's one of the houses Ryan Murphy owns still. He was an abstract impressionist, Hans Hofmann, and he would teach people that in his studio. Okay. So that's the oldest house in Provincetown, number 72. That was built all using wood from shipwrecks, and it's got a green facade, and it's a traditional cape, with the 2 windows on each side, full-length windows. Just to the side of it, there's a little green pathway that you can cut through, and that was an old road in the colonial days that people would actually walk from the harbor up into town on that road. That's still preserved. Captain Jack's Wharf, across the street from that, so I mentioned that previously. It's the one wharf that survived the Portland Gale. Captain Jack Williams was a fisherman through the 1880s, and after he built this wharf off his property, he rented pier shacks and sheds to tourists. Tennessee Williams romanced Kip Kiernan here in the 1940s. There's a place out there for sale. I think it's $2 million. It's like 200 square feet. They're little condos. Okay, so at this point, you're going to start to see some of the houses have this little blue plaque on them. A house floating on a wave. That means it was a house from Long Point. Long Point is at the very tip of Cape Cod. So if you're in town and you're looking across the harbor, you can see Long Point Light and the little barrier beach out there. So there were 38 families that lived out there from 1818 to the 1860s. And they had a church, they had a school, they had salt works. And right around the 1860s, they decided they wanted to move back to town. The fishing, even at that point, had gotten, it wasn't worth being out of town. They were right on the fishing grounds when they built it, but then by then they decided we're going to move back because we still have to travel so far now to reach the fish. So they actually floated them back. They put them on a barge and floated them back across the harbor. And this little one on the right there is that was the bakery. So the baker continued to bake while she was being floated back. So there's only 2 or 3 like the bakery that are in the original condition. Most of them have been, given basements and second floors and all that. But there's one in the East End. That's Donald McMillan's childhood home, the man with the pier's name for it. The rest are all in the West End. Then, I'm going to skip this because I have this twice, I think. Yeah. So these are kind of the 2 prominent inns down in the West End. There's the Land's End Inn and the Red Inn. So the Red Inn was a woman whose husband was lost at sea, so she started to rent rooms out. And she charged 5 cents a night. And now the Land's End Inn charges $500 a night. It's a Victorian, up on the hill, you get a great view of the harbor, 360-degree views. That was built by Charles Higgins. Charles Higgins was a haberdasher who grew up in Provincetown, but he moved to Boston. He was a descendant of Peregrine White. So Peregrine White was the first child born on Mayflower in Provincetown Harbor. They filmed a movie there in 1995. Lie Down with Dogs. I don't know, maybe people didn't see it. So almost to the end of Commercial Street now, we're going through Delft Haven. Does anyone know what Delft Haven was? that was the place in Holland where the Pilgrims left. So they were English, right, but they had tried living in Holland for about 12 years, and they felt their children were losing their English culture, so they left there, sailed back to England, and they were supposed to have 2 boats, the Mayflower and Speedwell. And they set off, and before they even got out of sight of land, the Speedwell started taking on water. So they had to go back and get on the Mayflower, and this is all delayed, right? They were planning to do this earlier in the season, they didn't get out until September. So by the time they got here, it was November. So Delfthaven was named after a place in Holland. And here's Stanley Kunitz, who I mentioned this earlier. So he started the Fine Arts Work Center. He was a poet laureate for twice in the United States. That was his home just until last year. It was just demolished, and now they're building a big house there now. So at the West End Rotary, they, in the year 2020, for the 400th anniversary, they created a little park commemorating Pilgrim's Landing. So that's Pilgrim's Landing Park right in the center. There's some plantings there. There's the breakwater. So when you're at the breakwater, if you look over to your left, between the breakwater and the Provincetown Inn, there's a little white buoy in the water. That's supposedly the place where the Mayflower anchored for 6 weeks while they went around. Okay. Then we're going to start to drive up Moores Road into the National Seashore. So Cape Cod National Seashore was developed, well, the legislation was signed by President John Kennedy, so when he was in the Senate in 1957, he decided he wanted to preserve this place, and most people down here are familiar with the whole story of Fort Hill and the subdivision, but the dudes in Provincetown actually had blueprints to become a casino resort. Walter Chrysler from the car company, he owned what's today the Provincetown Library, as at one time his art museum, and he wanted to develop the dunes out there. So that kind of the impetus. People said we need to protect this. They wrote to the senator, and then by good fortune he was president. 4 years later he signed the legislation. So it's 44,000 acres. It's, you know, you all know all about the National Seashore. It's how beautiful it is. It's a good, beautiful bike trail out there, about 11 miles of bike trails through the dunes and forest in Provincetown. And there's Race Point Light, so if we're kind of working our way along Herring Cove Beach on the left, and there's, you see Race Point off to your left. So anyone know why it's called Race Point? What's a race? It's where 2 bodies of water come together. So you have Cape Cod Bay and the Atlantic. They meet out at the knuckles of the arm. And the bay is about 10 degrees warmer than the ocean, so you get these cross currents because the cold water is denser and it goes down. So that's why it's such a great fishing place, and that's why there's so many whales there, because they're feeding on the plankton and the fish that are there. You may remember a few years ago the guy that got in the whale's mouth.
Yes.
Okay? So he was Ann Packard. She's an artist in town. That was her son. So a lot of guys that do construction, because everything is tear downs now, they salvage the old toilet bowls, and they've created a toilet bowl reef off Race Point. So he was diving for lobsters in the toilet bowl reef, because lobsters like hiding places and crevices, and in a sandy beach like this, there isn't a lot of structure for them. So it's a good spot. And humpback whale came along, kind of scooped him up, filtered the water, because they're plankton eaters, so they're just going to filter the water and spit it out. And he got spit out, and he was fine. He was a little shaken up. That was on a Race Point. There is a keeper's house out there that you can rent overnight. And then we get up into dune shacks. So we're up around the visitor center area. So right now we've kind of driven from Herring Cove up to the visitor center through that area known as the Province Lands. That's Province Land Road. And the Province Land are the second oldest common area in the United States. 1654 they were established. So the Pilgrims that were here in 1620, they remember this place. And so people from Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is now Boston, or Plymouth Colony, they would come back and harvest the trees, and they would then graze their livestock out there once it was cleared. And after Boston Common being the first common area, this was the second, and it was a place that people would share in common to do their resource extraction or graze their animals. So the dune shacks out there, there's 19 of them now. Originally there were more. The Park Service in the 1980s, in their infinite wisdom, burned down half of them because they wanted to restore it to wilderness area. But then the people in town said, oh, there's a lot of history here, a lot of famous writers here, and so they got them listed on the National Historic Register. So now Park Service said, okay, we own them. The way the Park Service ended up owning them was because I know there's been a lot of misinformation over the years, like last summer with people being evicted and all that. But you can, they were built by the Life Saving Service. The Life Saving Service we all know about was before the Coast Guard. They were built as shelters, most of them. And when the canal was built in 1915, the Life Saving Service ended. They were just kind of abandoned out there. But that coincided with the time the artists started coming to Provincetown. Artists started using them, for writing and painting and all. And but other than one, there's only one out there that the people had the foresight to get a title to. The Malakote family, Philip Malakote. The others were just squatters. So the Park Service in the 60s, they took them over, and they took them 20 years to figure out what to do with them. In the 80s, they created these situations where, I forget the exact numbers, but some are leased to private individuals, if you can prove your connection to the place. Some are leased to art cooperatives and things like that. So if you're an artist, you can do a residency there. The Peaked Hill Trust is a nonprofit. They run a lottery that the public can use them for a week at a time. So there's all kinds of different arrangements out there. And you can get to them by hiking through the dunes, or you can do an arts dune tour and see many of them. The nearest one would be from the visitor center, would be the Seascape Shack, and that's one for artists. So they're scattered throughout about 2,000 acres worth of dune landscape out there. Okay. So I mentioned the promised lands already, the history of them. A lot of people don't realize there's some great cranberries out there. If you go in the low-lying areas of the dunes, they're wetlands. And in the National Seashore, you can pick a gallon a day of any of the wild fruits. So right now we're just finishing the blueberry season, you're getting into beach plum season, and then come November, you'll be able to go out there and pick wild cranberries. All right, so we're out in the dunes, you're looking back, you're going to see the Pilgrim Monument. I kind of mentioned this before, about 1907 it was built. Teddy Roosevelt came and laid the cornerstone. It was really built just as a kind of a competition with Plymouth, really. Everyone would go to Plymouth Rock, and so let's build this thing. So someone said, oh, I saw a great tower in Siena, Italy. Let's build one like that. And that's what it is. There's a great museum in the bottom of it. They just renovated in 2020. They made the exhibits, especially the Native American exhibit, much more up to date. I really recommend seeing it, but it goes through all the different historical periods in Provincetown history: the Native American, the AIDS crisis, the fishing, the Long Point community, Macmillan's Arctic explorations. It's really good. So 1910, it was finished, and President Howard Taft came to dedicate it. Then in 2010, for the 100th anniversary, they invited President Obama to come, but he didn't. 2016, Hillary Clinton was running for president. She came and gave a speech there, but it was Labor Day weekend, and tickets were not selling too well, and they were afraid it was going to be a big crowd and be embarrassing. So they said, let's have someone join her. Who's the most popular person in Provincetown? Who do you think that would be? Not someone from Provincetown, but if you're walking around Provincetown, who would you see the most impersonators of?
We share.
Cher, yeah. So Cher came to town, and they had a fundraiser. And that was the last time the closest we've come since, having a president. So I mentioned earlier about the dune shacks. The Old Harbor Life-Saving Station out there in the dunes was part of that history, the life-saving history. This particular building actually wasn't in Provincetown. There were some in Provincetown, but they were removed. This one was in Chatham, and in 1977 it was floated up there to become a museum, as it is today, for the Park Service. Fortunately, 3 months later, the blizzard of '78 came and it would have been lost. Where it was in Chatham got totally wiped out. So it was good fortune. You can still go up there. Thursdays, 5 o'clock, they do a reenactment of a drill. And if you've ever been there, it's really good to see that all the equipment they use. They would fire a line out to, oh yeah, right here we have it, yeah. Fire a breeches buoy and a line, and then people would get a zip line back by putting their legs through a pair of canvas pants tied to a life preserver. Reminds me too of one other thing I forgot to mention when we were talking about Long Point. Does anyone know there's two, there was a life-saving station out there, but there was also two forts out there. So during the Civil War, after all the houses had been floated back, they built two forts. You know what they're called?
Useless.
Fort Useless.
Ridiculous.
Fort Ridiculous.
Just say last one.
That's hilarious.
Because they were never used. But during the War of 1812, the harbor was occupied by the British, so they thought, there's a chance this could happen again. So they're still out there. They're just these mounds in the sand. You can kind of see them. And then, I can't see it. The life-saving service went away when they built the canal, replaced by the Coast Guard. So that was the original Coast Guard building out on Race Point Beach. And then in '79, they built one in town, so that's now a Park Service building. So that whole area is known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. That's why the life-saving service is out there. You all know, I'm sure, that one, that museum in Provincetown, and then the Beachcomber in Wellfleet are the only two remaining structures. But there was one of those every 6 miles along the outer beach because there were 3,000 ships wrecked trying to get around the Cape. A couple of the more famous ones, I'm sure you all know the story of the Widow, but did you know that Sam Bellamy, who was the pirate captain, the character that Johnny Depp plays in the Pirates of the Caribbean was modeled after him. Kind of a funny, awkward pirate. He wouldn't kill people, he'd just take their ship, but then he'd give them his. And then the Somerset was another pretty famous shipwreck. It's out on Race Point, and every 20 years or so it gets uncovered. That was the British naval ship 1778 that wrecked out there. It was the ship that Paul Revere 3 years earlier had seen coming into Boston Harbor. He did his famous ride. That wrecked off Provincetown in 1778. And all the British Navy men were marched from Provincetown up to Boston. So that could come up again. It's been about 20 years since that last appeared. These ships, the sand just covers them and uncovers them. So now we're driving through the beach forest. So completely different landscape than we've been in. The dunes, right? We just dropped down in elevation, and now we're in this lush forest. Unfortunately, it's not going to be lush for much longer because the beach leaf disease is killing all the beech trees. But for now, anyway, it's still pretty nice, and there's a great trail around the pond. Mary Oliver was probably the most famous Provincetown poet who used beech forest. She wrote many of her poems out there. She died just a few years ago. You can still find her pencils, unless it's someone else doing it. But she used to leave pencils in trees along the trail because she would want to have a pencil when she thought to write something down. And I found pencils in the tree. Now, it could be someone else doing it, but she specifically did that. And then Harry Kemp was someone that, an artist. He was a poet. And he lived in the chicken coop of the Coast Guard building that was out in the dunes. That was his dune shack. And so we get further into town, we're going to see a little bit more about him. Yeah, you can go. So now we're at the lights. The only one light, traffic light in all of Provincetown. And we're going to take a left, and we're going to go on Route 6 west to go to the east end, because it's so twisted like that. And you'll see a sign there, if you ever notice this when you're leaving Provincetown, the mileage to California. Originally, that road went all the way to Long Beach, California, and it was the original cross-country road. There's a few others now, and then it was realigned, and now it just goes to Bishop, California. So we're going to take a left on Hanlon Street, go back into town, and we're going to go by Harry Kemp Way on the right. So there's a little road named after him. Directly across from that is the Old Colony Nature Trail. That was the Old Colony Railroad that I mentioned before. It used to come right along what's now Route 6, right along into town where the CVS is now. That was the train depot. So Harry Kemp, when he got a lot older, his friends tried to convince him to come back to town to live. So it was 1959, and they finally convinced him to by building him a shack in town. So if you're going down Howland Street, before you hit Bradford, there's a little shack off to your left, the Tasha Hill area, and that's, he died a year later. That was his shack in town. Okay, so we did a little bit of a pivot here, because if we went left on Commercial Street, which we can't, we'd get down here. I just wanted to show you these two houses. This was Norman Mailer's house. Everyone knows Norman Mailer, the author, and all. He died, I think, in 2005. It's been sold. Behind that, there's a shed. That's where Roy Cohn used to stay when he would come to Provincetown. And then 627. Oh, 627 is Norman Mailer's house. Oh, 629, sorry, was Robert Motherwell's house, known as Seaborn. He was an artist. So Lewis Wharf on the East End, that's where Mary Heaton Vorse and Eugene O'Neill started the Provincetown Players, America's oldest theater company. And that still exists, but they're in New York City now. That was on a pier out on the harbor there at 571 Commercial Street. There's a little plaque for that. Okay. And then we get into the gallery district. So if you ever go up to Provincetown on a Friday after 4 o'clock, all the galleries are open. They all have open houses, so you can get free wine and hors d'oeuvres and things. You don't have to buy dinner. And you can just look at all the different artwork. I definitely recommend going to 422? I think. Yeah, I think it's 422. It's a commons gallery, so anyone who can't afford to rent gallery space, like rent a building, they can rent space for a week to show their things. So that's a place that you definitely want to support if you can. And there's just lots of galleries there. You know, all the artists that started coming here in that early 1900s. Well, I think the next slide lists some of them. Well, it will. That's okay. You keep going. This is no, go back. Because this is a kind of a cool house here. So on your right, there's the figurehead house. If you ever noticed that, there's a statue of a woman perched over the door entrance. That was found by Captain Henry Cook floating in the Indian Ocean in 1872. And he pulled it on board and cut it down to size and brought it home and put it on his roof. So ships in those days, they would have like a woman figurehead on the front, like to bring them good luck. Okay. So just beyond that, a couple things. There's the Beachcombers Club. So the Beachcomber Club is kind of like a writers group, kind of a secretive men's writers group that get together in this old building there. So some of the more recent people that wrote things that got published was like Sebastian Younger or Michael Cunningham, people like that. But Dennis Minsky, who writes for the newspaper, he's a member of that club. They meet there. And then the flagship restaurant, well, it's not a restaurant anymore, but that's where Anthony Bourdain got his first job. Not as a cook, but as a just working in the kitchen. And then he got hired. A couple years later, he got hired to work at Sarah and Sal, and that's where he learned to cook. Across the street. So I mentioned before Donald McMillan. So his house is the only one that was floated over, has that little blue plaque, and we talked about his history already. Mary Heaton Vorse, I mentioned her. She started the theater company with Eugene O'Neill. So her house is directly across the street from the McMillan house, and it's been bought by someone who's somewhat renovating it, and he's opened it to the public, and they have different events there. She was a women's rights activist, a reporter, labor rights person. Was a big, very outspoken person in the 1920s and 30s. Okay. So some of the artists that came there, so Miller Hill is off Bradford Street, and at the top of the hill there's an old barn. That's where Charles Hawthorne started the Cape Cod School of Art. Like I said, it was a modern impressionism design. So he started that up there. Hans Hoffman was a student there, and then he started his studio. We should talk about his house in the West End. Jackson Pollock studied there, and he spent time in town. Tennessee Williams wrote a lot of his work along with Eugene O'Neill in the Atlantic House, at the Atlantic House Bar. Tennessee Williams stayed in one of the dune shacks. He actually auditioned Marlon Brando for Streetcar Named Desire out in one of the dune shacks. Michael Cunningham, more recent, John Waters, the film producer. He doesn't own a place in town, but he comes every summer. He rents the place, and you can see him riding his bike up and down. And Blanche Lozelle, she started, I think the next slide shows one of her works. And she started a print block style that's unique to Provincetown. And there's another firehouse that was, that's now a retail store. So there are all these firehouses scattered throughout. And here's the Art Association Museum. So the original one was to the right, and then in the 60s they did a renovation, an addition. So they're both side by side now. And then about 20 years ago they did an even bigger renovation. So they have about 3,000 works of art there. They're not, most of them are in archives. It's not that big a space, but they have a lot of local artists. I know a couple summers ago they had Hopper, a lot of his stuff. Sal Del Deo, who is still alive and a painter, he has some things in there. And then the library, so I mentioned before, it used to be a Methodist church. It was the largest Methodist church in New England at one time. And it was Walter Chrysler's Art Museum. Then it became a tourist information place for the town. Then it became the town library. So they put a half actual size model of the Rose Dorothea on the second floor of the library. You can still go in there and see it. It's free. So working our way down Provincetown, down Commercial Street back towards the center. Women's Craft. I don't know if you ever noticed that store there, but it is a store that was started by women, and it was a place for women to sell things that they made. A lot of women that were in abusive relationships and things like that. It's still one of the few all women owned and operated stores. So the Pilgrim House is another old hotel in town, and they do shows there. And I found a good quote from it. So Henry Thoreau stayed there in 1857, and his quote was, "I spent 4 memorable nights there in as many different years, and I have added to my knowledge of the cat and the bedbug." Sleep was out of the question. Now today there's also a tourism office. This was the old library. Back when this was the library, the man who owned the house with the figurehead over it, Henry Cook, his daughter was the librarian here. And when Eugene O'Neill won the whatever prize authors win, the Pulitzer Prize? Yeah. He was celebrating, and he came in the library drunk, so she revoked his library card. And in his next play, he wrote, he had a character with her name, Abby Putnam Cook, who was like a very bad person. So the Portuguese bakery, it's changed hands since the original owners, but it's still have a lot of the same stuff, although I guess there's 2 things that aren't there anymore.
Right. The date nut squares, those were my favorite.
Yeah. Keeping the heritage alive, and the, I don't know if you ever noticed the gallery there. So that was Bob Casoy. So the story, and I've heard conflicting information on this, so I don't know if it's 100% true, but the story is he was in Vietnam, and he said that if he made it back, he would spend the rest of his life on hallucinogenic drugs. And that's what he created. And then right before Town Hall, the last thing is, probably you never noticed it, there used to be a restaurant there called Stormy Harbor, and then up above that, kind of the prime real estate in town is owned by a group called the Knights of Columbus. And the Knights of Columbus is a men's Catholic organization. And I just wanted to kind of end here because it's kind of an interesting story. So in 2005, St. Peter's Church burned, and then it was rebuilt. It was a beautiful mural behind the altar that was painted on the wall that was lost, painted by a local artist. And when they rebuilt the new church, which is on the bottom center and to the right, that stained glass window was a recreation of that painting. It's the apostles on the water and trying to, not having faith and not being able to stay in the water. That was the original church there. Even before that. And that church was built by the Portuguese immigrants here. Go ahead for a second. Think. Okay, go back for a second. Sorry. So a lot of people, think of Provincetown as this very welcoming place that there's never any problems. But the Ku Klux Klan actually came to Provincetown and tried to burn down that church, the original church, because they were protesting the immigrant people that were here. So, do we go to the next one?
What's that little building on the right?
That's the church today.
No, I'm sorry, on the left.
The other way.
This one?
Oh, so this is across from Town Hall. It's a retail shop now. It used to be a restaurant called Stormy Harbor, and the Knights of Columbus are upstairs. That organization.
So how does that little building relate to what you just told us about the church?
Because the Knights of Columbus were the ones that were started because, I didn't say that, they were started because the Ku Klux Klan came to town to burn down the church, and they wanted to start an organization to help protect the Catholic immigrant families there.
Do they still exist?
They still exist, yeah. So it's funny, when I taught there, I used to help out with the youth group at the church, and they would always give us money, like to take kids to Six Flags and stuff. So I said, well, I want to join, I want to help you guys raise money. And I get there, and I was like, well, you're all just drinking beer. And I said, well, what are we going to do to raise money? He said, we don't raise money, we just collect the rent from the store down below. But they're very generous. So I guess my point in mentioning that about the KKK was, despite, no, you can keep going.
Okay.
Despite the wonderful place that we think Provincetown is, things like that always happen. And going back in time, behind Town Hall, there's the relief sculpture of the Pilgrims signing the Mayflower Compact. And that's really a reminder of that the democracy really started there. These were people that came to a new land, and they had this charter from the king, but because they were not where they were supposed to be, right? They were supposed to be down in the Jamestown colony, and they got, GPS wasn't working, and they ended up 500 miles north. So they had to create this new document. They decided to be in this place, and it was really about honoring people's rights and being the ability to be themselves. And yeah, the women weren't allowed to sign and all that, but that's a whole different story, But the concept was there, and that brings us back to the AIDS Memorial. What I really appreciate about Provincetown was the wonderful community that it was to everyone. No matter who you are, you're gonna be okay there. And that's kind of the way Provincetown is for everybody, I think. So that's the tour. Thank you.
Okay.